Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is James Curtis, and he published a book about somebody who I just found out recently passed away in late 2021. I think it was October. His name is Mort Sahl, who's a comedian who I remember seeing, and I've watched some of his bits on YouTube, which are around there. But the book he wrote is titled Last Man Standing, Mort Sahl and the Birth of Comedy. And James Curtis has also written other books. His other titles are William Cameron Menzies, The Shape of Films to Come, Spencer Tracy, a biography, W.C. Fields, a biography, James Whale, A New World of Gods and Monsters, Between Flops, a biography of Preston Sturges, and then he's edited a couple books. One is The Creative Producer and also Featured Player. But again, this is Mort Sahl had a very long career and was around and knew a lot of people. Really, I think the title of the book is very apt. The Birth of Modern Comedy is something that Mort Sahl was at right after World War II. So, James Curtis, welcome to the show, and thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you, William. Happy
So,
to
for
be here.
people, great, awesome. For people who have not heard of your name or maybe your books, can you talk about your background and your other kind of books and what you've written and what led you to writing about Mort Sahl?
Well, the subjects I've dealt with, for the most part, are people whom I became familiar with initially when I was a kid. And I revisited their work as an adult in later years and became more curious about them if there weren't good books about them. And so that's basically what happened. I was exposed to older work back when I was consuming television at a frightening rate, which would be back around late 50s, early 60s, especially. And Mort was just one of those figures. He had a talk show on local television here in Los Angeles. And so I think that's where I first discovered him. And then later I was able to see him live in jazz clubs out here, principally jazz clubs. That usually was his venue before we had comedy clubs. And I was always quite fascinated by him, and so I wondered why there wasn't a biography of him, and that's why I decided to tackle this subject. And I thought it would be interesting because he's the only subject I've ever attempted who was still alive at the time.
Right,
There's
and you
this,
reached out to him too for the book, right?
yeah, I did, and through his manager, and I said, would Mort be in any way interested in cooperating with a book on the subject? And so it was kind of a touch and go thing for a while. Mort was by nature kind of a suspicious character, and he wasn't sure whether he could trust me or not. So we had some interesting times, but ultimately he decided I was okay. We actually bonded over jazz. He's a well known jazz aficionado and very knowledgeable. And I was able to expose him to some things that he hadn't seen or heard before, and he wasn't used to that. So that kind of earned me some credibility points with him, and it paved the way for really a great relationship, and it continued on until his recent death.
And you add a lot of his personal statements into this book, in the
Yeah.
entirety of his book. So, what were those years that you reached out to him and knew him?
Well, I think I approached him initially in 2011, 11 or 12, and so we met up in Mill Valley at a restaurant for lunch, and just to give him a look at me and talk a bit in general terms if we could get along. And my wife remembers when we started recording because we ultimately recorded about 40 hours of conversations. And my wife remembers me calling the first night from San Francisco and saying, "I don't know if I can do this." And and it did take a while, but the thing about Mort is there wasn't much on paper other than news clippings about him. He wasn't a guy that kept carbons of letters or wrote a lot of letters or kept diaries, things like that. It was all in his head, and so the way to get at it was just simply to sit and talk with him, and that's what I did. And those 40 hours will be kind of interesting one day, maybe 100 years from now, when someone comes along and decides to listen to them. But the best of them informed the text in the book. And then, of course, I went out and talked to a lot of people who knew him and worked with him, and also did a lot of digging. And the result was the book.
Right. And I mean, you include so much. He was really in the midst of things. He seemed to have a lot of very well known people in Los Angeles. I mean, I think that's one aspect of his character is that he started in San Francisco, but he considered himself a son of Los Angeles. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, he was born in Canada, but he really grew up in Los Angeles, and his family moved out here, I'd say, oh, he was about 6 years old. And so he had a lot of experience seeing movies downtown Los Angeles, things like that. And so Los Angeles is really the place that he called home. And when he started in San Francisco is because he had followed the woman who would be his eventually first wife up to Berkeley, where she was going to go to school. He went to USC himself, and so he led a kind of hand-to-mouth existence, slept on people's floors and sofas and things, and really had a really good chance of being homeless
Right.
when he was kind of pointed in the direction of the hungry eye, and he kind of figured out why actually standing in front of audiences where his strengths were, and he had a natural gift for talking to people and fascinating them. Let's put it that way as well, and so. Starting at the Hungry Eye, he broke through with audiences eventually and became a sensation. And
Can you talk about kind of North Beach at that time? That it was what 1953, I think, is when he did his first
yeah,
show.
that's correct. And North Beach was a very bohemian place. There were all manner of restaurants, bookstores. City Lights bookstore, the famous City Lights, was in North
From
Beach.
Getty.
Yeah, and the Purple Onion, clubs, both straight, gay, jazz, whatever. Even opera was the entertainment choice at one place, and so it was a really heady brew of various ethnicities, interests, political persuasions, etc. And so it was in a way the perfect place for someone like him to come along because he was breaking all the rules and essentially. Well, as I like to say, he changed the culture and he created an entire new way of expressing oneself comedically and kind of opened the door. Let's say he kicked open the door for people like Mike Nichols and Elaine May and Lenny Bruce and the people that came after them.
And can you describe what set him apart? I mean, he seemed to be self-aware that he was different than everybody else. What set him apart from other comedians?
Well, he didn't work with prepared material. There were things that he would develop over time, but he worked more with themes and with things written out. So he had a great memory, for one thing, which lasted practically up to the day he died. And he would read voraciously. He would read multiple newspapers every day. He would read the news magazines, Newsweek, Time, etc. He would consume everything he could get his hands on, and he retained it all. And he had a way of taking the spin that was on, especially political subjects at that time, and seeing the absurdity in it, and doing it in a dry but at the same time whimsical way. And it was unlike anything anybody else did. And it was the smart audiences that he found in a place like the Hungry Eye who could appreciate what he had to say. He wasn't a baggy pantsed burlesque comedian or telling jokes about how fat his wife was, that sort of thing. He was out to talk about people like Senator Joseph McCarthy, Richard Nixon, President Eisenhower, etc. And so he would say things like during the reelection campaign, vote for Eisenhower, let's keep the White House empty another 4 years, that sort of thing.
Right.
And nobody had heard it put that way before.
And he was kind of against the grain. People thought of him. It was strange because there's a kind of oppositional element of his character. He was very patriotic American, but then
Hmm.
he would skewer the politicians, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that people didn't really do at that time. The two forebears that you could look at and say, okay, well, they kind of set the stage for Mort Sahl were Will Rogers and then Bob Hope. But Bob Hope tended, when he said things political, which weren't that often, they came off as friendly. Mort didn't come off as friendly. Mort came off as outraged. And I think that was the big difference. In some ways, he found his way to the emotions of the audience and to tell them what they should be paying attention to and why he found it outrageous. And that was new. That was completely new.
Right. So he has this jazz kind of environment. He's in a bohemian part of Los Angeles, but he has a preppy. I mean, you showed on the cover of your book. This is his stage outfit: is a collared shirt, V-neck sweater, and paper. Right.
Right. His character, he thought about it, and he said because he was essentially in a college town, and he said, who would ruminate on subjects like this? And he thought a grad student. So a grad student would be wearing a pullover sweater, white socks, open collar, and old comedians at that time, if they weren't wearing tux, they were at least wearing coats and ties and behaving in a certain semi-formal way. And Mort was the guy that came along and did away with all that. So for the first time, you had someone out there who was casual, not only in terms of his appearance, but in his thoughts and his opinions.
And he was friends, very close friends with an interesting character that San Francisco's of that era knew, who was Herb Caen, right? And
Herb
how
Caen, absolutely.
can you talk about their friendship?
Well, Herb Caen, of course, would crawl around town every night to gather material that he could fill his nightly column with, or his daily column, I should say. And so he had heard about Mort, but he actually hadn't taken him in at the Hungry Eye until one night. This is when Mort had been playing the Hungry Eye several months, I think, before Herb Caen actually saw him in person. And it's probably a good thing that Herb Caen waited that long because Mort's initial weeks at the Hungry Eye were not terribly successful. And it was to Enrico Banducci's credit that he left Mort on the stage because he could have said, "Hey, you're not getting along with the audience here. To take a hike," and he didn't do that. The thing about the Hungry Eye was up to until the point at which Mort came to them. It was strictly a music venue. You had folk singers, you had musicians, instrumentalists, but nobody who approached being a comedian. And so Mort was different for them, and it took a while for the audiences to catch on. But when they did catch on, they caught on a big way, and that, of course, fueled Mort's creativity. And so when Herb Caen saw him for the first time, Mort had settled into a pattern, and he was doing very well at it. And that created a level of enthusiasm that resulted in multiple mentions in the Herb Caen column and encouraging everybody to go to the Hungry Eye and see him. And it got so that he was drawing crowds to such an extent that they had to move the Hungry Eye out of its original location into a larger location across the street just so they could handle the audience demands. And that's when Mort became a real celebrity.
That's it. So Herb Caen kind of propelled him into the public, and that was actually, people who don't know, because this is before internet or anything. That column in San Francisco Chronicle was what people read the Chronicle for, is to try to see what was going on, and it talked about famous people and things like that. So,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It was the best read column in San Francisco, and being in Herb Caen's column I mean, it was a regional column. It wasn't syndicated, but if you were in Herb Caen's column, your target audience would know about you because everybody read Herb Caen.
right. So he starts becoming famous. And can you talk about, I mean, yeah, it's important to think about the time and place of the 50s, that he was trying to come up before, like you said, before comedy clubs. So how did he kind of go from just working in San Francisco to becoming more popular around the country?
Well, this is where he really truly changed the culture because he he had to find places where he could work. and they weren't there. There were no comedy clubs back then, and if you went to nightclubs, it was singers and musicians of various sorts. And if you had a comedian, they were always the opening act, and it was always somebody like, oh, say, Henny Youngman, who had a seemingly endless stream of one-liners. But again, non-political, not thoughtful in that respect. And so Mort kind of stumbled on the idea of jazz clubs because there were jazz clubs in all the major markets. And that was the kind of audience he knew from experience that he wanted to talk to. And so Mort built an informal network of such clubs around the country. And you had places like Mr. Kelly's in Chicago and Storyville in Boston and Basin Street East in New York City, et cetera. So in each of those, or the Crescendo out in Los Angeles and the Interlude, which was above the Crescendo. And in each case, invariably in each case, Mort was the first spoken word act, as they said in those days, spoken word act to appear at any of those venues. He was the first non-musician to appear at those venues. And he was so startlingly new and different that he demanded people's attention. And as a result of that, he got all the press that he could possibly want, and it was rapturous. And so once Mort had set up this trail, if you will, this comedic trail for the new comedy, then people like Shelley Berman and Nichols and May and Henny Youngman, not Henny Youngman, but
Lenny Bruce, maybe?
Lenny Bruce. I was getting Henny Youngman and Lenny Bruce confused, which people don't necessarily make that mistake. And the others that came along after them, and there was a place for them to perform then, and it just kind of magnified and it grew as a result. So you had this whole group of comedians, satirist, I guess, is a better word to use for them, and they became in a sense tarred to a certain degree by Lenny Bruce when he became more popular and more familiar to people. It became not only the new smart comedy, but in some ways dangerous comedy. And Time Magazine especially took off after these people because the presumption was they all had dirty minds and they all had subversive thoughts, and they were kind of sugarcoating the messages that they had, and that every one of them was a communist of one sort or another. So they were interesting times, and
Yeah, right.
Mort kind of rode that wave more than anybody.
And that was the era, that was the era. I mean, he told jokes about Curtis LeMay, some of
Yep.
these other far right characters. You said Richard Milhouse Nixon was his most reliable punching bag. So
Yes,
he
it
was
was.
going after these guys. I mean, and he was connected to and knew a lot of people you said he opened for Billie Holiday. What are some of
Yep.
these other people like Hugh Hefner or something that he associated with? He associated with a lot of famous people.
Well, Hefner was in his own way engaged in his own social revolution with Playboy magazine, and Mort and he came on at both about the same time, both I think in '53, and as a result of that, they became fast friends. But Hefner was selling the idea of a lifestyle, with the apartment and the stereo and a sense of quality to the liquor they were drinking, that sort of thing. And Playboy was all about that. Now, of course, Playboy was garnished with writers like Norman Mailer and a certain intellectual pretension, while most people were there to take a look at the centerfolds. And Mort understood that, but Mort gave Hefner, like some of the writers that Hefner published, a certain validation. And so from that perspective, he was extremely important to Playboy in the same sense that Hefner was important to him, Playboy, in terms of speaking to the kind of audience that Mort wanted to speak to. And so jazz became an issue with Mort with Playboy. Playboy didn't start out as kind of a home for writing on jazz, intelligent writing on jazz, but it became one. And Mort was one of the people who put a front on the Playboy Jazz Festival the first time they did it in Chicago. And ultimately at other jazz festivals as well. But he was different from everybody else in that he did not play an instrument, he did not sing. But his delivery had a certain rhythm to it that geared with an improvisational mindset was musical. And that, I think, is why he got across to people who regularly came to jazz clubs around the country, and why he was an acceptable act to them.
Right, and he had that monologue, but he was one of the first kind of comedians to get into the new media of records, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, he. It is said, and I think it's true, that he recorded the first modern comedy album. Comedy albums being rare at the time, and if you walked into a record store in 1954, you wouldn't necessarily see a bin that was labeled comedy. It would be a spoken word bin where you'd have poets reading their stuff and great speeches of history and things like that. So the first, there were comedy albums before this, but invariably they were albums that were recorded in a recording studio. In other words, there was no audience. And so you did not have the feedback of an audience that was going to laugh at something that you've said or done. Mort's first album was called Mort Sahl at Sunset, and it was recorded in Monterey in 1955. And he was not aware that it was being recorded that night. The recording equipment and the crew was there to record Dave Brubeck. And Mort was on the bill that night with Dave Brubeck and Paul Desmond, and they happened to run the tape on Mort as well as Brubeck. And this was Fantasy Records, and they proceeded to issue an album without Mort's knowledge or his consent. So that was Mort Sahl at Sunset, and Mort objected to this because he rightly determined that by the time they got it out, the material was stale, and went to court and forced him to withdraw it. But it was still the first mainstream comedy album that had a genuine audience attached to it, and so for the first time, you got to hear Mort in a typical setting in an auditorium. With a live appreciative audience that was also there to hear Dave Brubeck, who was also a tremendously popular and getting more so jazz act. And so others came along after that. The first one that Mort did when he signed with Norman Granz was to tell Shelley Berman, whom he had helped come up in the club scene, to consider doing an album of his own. And so Shelley's first album was a big hit. Mort was always kind of a cult figure. Shelley Berman was very accessible on a wide range of listeners, and so his album, which was called Inside Shelley Berman, sold tremendously. I mean, it's just unheard of that a comedy album would sell like that. And so he did others, and he was the one that really kind of put the comedy album on the commercial shelf. But it was Mort that pioneered it.
Yeah, fascinating. And so he kind of was starting to make legitimate money too, right around the mid 50s too.
Yeah, he was doing well, and television came calling, and so he was put under contract to CBS, but they could never seem to figure out what to do with him.
Yeah, and I mean, I think he just didn't. It wasn't an easy fit. There's a theme in the book about him being too intellectual, or not being not as, like you said, not as generally popular as everybody. Yeah. But he was also in films too, right?
Yeah, he was. He was not a great actor, we must admit. The best thing that he did from an acting standpoint was his first film, which was called In Love and War. And he played a Marine during World War II in it. He was with a group of them, R.J. Wagner being one of them, Jeffrey Hunter being another, etc. And Mort was allowed by the writer and director Philip Dunn to write his own part. And so Mort wrote all his own dialogue, and it worked. Later on, when he had to speak other people's dialogue, it didn't work so well because he was used to improvising. If you told Mort, here's the gist of your dialogue and say it in your own words, he was fine with that. If he had to learn a script, he wasn't fine.
And kind of one of his big early moments was at the 1959 Oscars. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was produced by Jerry Wald, a producer who took a great shine to Mort. And Jerry Wald was a big Hollywood producer at the time, and he was asked to produce two Academy Award ceremonies in a row. And for the second one, he set up a format where you had six hosts. Bob Hope being one of them. I think Laurence Olivier was one of them. I forget offhand. It's been a long time since I've seen it. But Mort came out halfway through the program and he did about a 6-minute monologue that was kidding the film industry in general and the people that came out from the East Coast to make their way into the movies. And he talked about a lot of things that must have left the audience in Middle America scratching their heads because he was doing a lot of inside jokes about the Hollywood ranch market and things like that. And stage actors that would come out for a movie and would go in and buy one Coke rather than a 6-pack because they didn't know how long they were going to be staying there. And the audience got it, and in the studio or in the auditorium that night, but some people at home didn't necessarily. But it was a big bit of exposure for him to a national audience. And this was back at a time when the Academy Awards were essentially being covered on television like a news event. They weren't necessarily staging the Academy Awards for NBC, but NBC covered it. And so Mort got some exposure, some real mainstream exposure that he really hadn't had before.
Right. I think you said it was 40 to 70 million people.
Yeah.
Dorothy Kilgallen declared him the blockbuster of the evening. So, I mean, that was kind of put him right. Right. Would you agree that right around there, late 50s, early 60s was kind of the apex of his career, maybe?
Yeah, it was 1960 that he was on the cover of Time magazine. So, yeah, I think that's a safe statement.
And can you talk about his relationship to JFK?
Well, he was recruited not by JFK, but by JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, who was in a way unofficially managing his son's campaign for president. And he got Mort on the phone one time. I think Mort was actually, no, Mort was not. Mort was not on location making a film at that point, but before that. And Joe Kennedy got him on the phone. He says, I hear you're funny, and I hear that you can stick the knife in between the second and third rib, and the guy doesn't even know it. And so he asked Mort to write zingers, if you will, for Jack Kennedy, and to suggest lines and the like that could be inserted into Kennedy's speeches. And so he did that. He thought it was an interesting challenge. And he said he never got paid for it. Considering how wealthy the Kennedys were, that's kind of a crime. But he still didn't regret it. But at the same time, he felt that maybe that was a good thing because he could take off after Kennedy and not feel any kind of loyalty to him because he was not on the payroll. And so he would write jokes for Kennedy, and at the same time, he would skewer Kennedy whenever it seemed appropriate.
Right, and I think he was a dinner in Beverly Hills that Mort Sahl hosted that included JFK. Right, it was like a Democratic fundraiser or something. Do you recollect that?
There were times Mort really considered his home base after the period with the Hungry Eye to be the Crescendo in Los Angeles. It was on the Sunset Strip, and the Crescendo, unlike some of the other clubs in the Sunset Strip, specialized in jazz acts. If you went to one of the other clubs, you might see Judy Garland or Peggy Lee. At the crescendo, you'd see Duke Ellington or Ella Fitzgerald, and Mort was the big noise at the crescendo at that time. And during the Democratic Convention in 1960, which was held at the Sports Arena in just south of downtown Los Angeles, people came and hung out at the crescendo because Mort was doing his act, and these were all political figures who wanted to see what Mort was like in a club setting. And one night he remembered Jack Kennedy coming in and sitting in the back of the room with a couple of his associates, and he was just going to see what the program was like. I'm not even sure the audience realized he was there. And Mort made a kind of insolent remark about Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. And he said in the back from the stage, he could hear Kennedy's fist go down on the table in the back of the room and say, "God damn it, he does it again." And so Kennedy was fond of Mort, and at the same time he was wary of Mort.
It seems like that kind of is the same thing because Mort ran into Nixon too, right? Just after he lost the governor's election.
Governor's election, where he gave the famous line to the press, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." And Mort was babysitting Paul Newman one night, who was a really famous heavy drinker. And Mort, surprisingly enough, he was not a drinker. He did not drink, and he did not smoke, nor did he use blue language at all, especially on stage. And so he was very close to Paul Newman, and Joanne Woodward was confident that if Newman was out with Mort, that he wouldn't get in any trouble because Mort was there. He was sober and he was keeping an eye on things. Well, they were at what was La Scala, I think, which was Mort's regular hangout, and Santa Monica Boulevard, and they were sitting at the bar. Mort was probably nursing a Coca-Cola, and Newman spied Nixon and his wife Pat at a table in the back of the room, and Mort hadn't noticed him, and so Newman pointed to him. He said, "Why don't you buy him a drink? You owe your livelihood to that guy." And so Mort sent a note over to the Nixon's table and said, "May I buy you a bottle of wine? May I send you a bottle of wine?" I think is the way he put it. And Nixon sent back the message, "Only if you'll join us." And so he and Paul Newman went over and joined the Nixons at their table. And Mort later said that he knew it was Nixon because immediately he tried to make a deal. And later on, it became part of Mort's act. Mort would describe the whole thing about Nixon looking at the wine list at the restaurant and seeing all the prices and the imports and everything, and being somewhat cheap, at least in Mort's telling. Nixon finally said, "By God, we're going to have good American wine." And he said, I remember him talking about the waiter listening to that and thinking, oh, he's thinking about Gallo, 95 cents a bottle, that sort of thing. And at one point, if you wait a minute, I'll make some for you, jumping up and down. And so Nixon's message to him was, keep the heat on Kennedy as well as me. And he certainly had no problem doing that.
Right, and he said that Mort Sahl was the Will Rogers of his time, so he keep getting labeled with this Will Rogers social commentary.
Time magazine, that cover story referred to him as Will Rogers with fangs.
Wow, yeah, so that's it. And I mean, you divide the book into two parts because I think that is important because that changed kind of his kind of outlook in life. Can you talk about what happened and why you have a part one and part two for Mort Sahl?
Well, part one ends on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, and part two begins with the aftermath of the assassination. And it really made a profound difference in his life because not at first, but not long afterwards, usually, actually with the issuance of the Warren Report, Mort started to satirize the Warren Report and the reasoning behind the Warren Report on stage. And it took hold of him in such a way that he eventually ended up working for the New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who was trying to establish a conspiracy to assassinate the president. Grew out of some local prominent citizens, let's put it that way, like Clay Shaw in New Orleans, and Mort felt so strongly that Garrison was onto something that he volunteered his time and worked for Garrison for a while as an unpaid volunteer investigator.
I
He was
think he
issued
was,
a badge.
yeah, he got a badge or something, or became a
Yeah,
sheriff or some kind of title.
yeah. So he was an investigator, and that really kind of colored his act and his whole attitude toward things for a period of about 10 years. But the thing that surprised me getting to know Mort was how much of his worldview, and especially his view of his ideal of America, let's put it that way, came from the movies that he consumed as a child. And he would see things like Frank Capra films in the mid and late 30s when he was a kid. And he would see that as the ideal for the country. And when something that was as inconceivable as the president being shot down in the middle of a street in Houston or Dallas, pardon me, it didn't compute with him. There had to be something behind it, because if this were a Hollywood film, let's say, especially one of the golden period, like the 30s and 40s and like, everything has a reason, everything has an answer in the end. And when something that is reasonless and defies answers happens, there's got to be an explanation for it, and that's what he felt, and I think that's the reason he felt that. And at the end of the day, it was his undoing in a way, because there was no rationale to what happened. It was crazy. It was shocking. It changed the course of history, but it was not a conspiracy in the sense that Garrison and he imagined it as being, but he was going to prosecute it and continue to prosecute it no matter what.
Right, and he kind of got blacklisted for those opinions too, right? I mean, it really.
Yeah, he lost his show in Los Angeles over it, and Mort was of the personality that if you told him not to do something or told him that he was damaging his own credibility by doing something, he would double down. And that's what he did, as a matter of fact. And so he went through a period where he was making appearances in nightclubs, and he would roll out the entire a table with the entirety of the bound volumes of the Warren Report on it, and he would start to litigate the Warren Report. And he had some good, funny comments about the Warren Report, but at the end of the day, there was so much anger mixed in with what he had to say that he was off-putting to a lot of audiences.
Interesting. Well, we're at 38 minutes. I mean, it's really interesting. There's a lot more to the book. There's a lot more to his life. I mean, what would you like to leave with the listener before we wrap it up?
Well, just that, as I said earlier, he changed the culture. And if you wonder where people like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert come from, look at Mort Sahl and how he established the landscape for which these guys could later work. You know, they're later generation people, of course, but the entire notion of smart comedy, as opposed to Take My Wife, Please, began with Mort Sahl. And so if you want to see how an entire cycle, an entire American cultural tradition got started, this is where you start. It's with the story of Mort Sahl.
Mort Sahl and Last Man Standing. And where's the best place to get the book?
Probably these days on Amazon or on Barnes & Noble. It was published in 2017, or at your local library, I guess.
Right. And you have a website, don't you?
Yeah,
James?
jamescurtis.net. And allow me to plug my new book, which is coming out on February 15th, and it's called Buster Keaton, A Filmmaker's Life.
Buster Keaton, A Filmmaker's Life is coming out. And you have all those other, 5 other books too. So that'll be a total of 7 books. And that's about Buster Keaton. He was the silent film star, right?
Yeah, the great stone face. And he was also one of our most brilliant directors of physical comedy. And so this is his story.
Gotcha. Okay. Buster Keaton, cool. And again, the website is jamescurtis.net. Title of the book we talked about is Last Man Standing, Mort Sahl and the Birth of Comedy. And Mort Sahl just recently passed away. But James Curtis, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
All right, stay there.